When 9-year-old Maribel walked barefoot into that Texas bank, nobody expected her crumpled paper to reveal an $847,000 inheritance. But greed has a way of turning heroes into villains and strangers into saviors. One employee's choice to show kindness would change everything. It's like if this moved you, subscribe for more stories and comment where you're watching from. The revolving glass door of Lone Star Bank caught the harsh Texas sun, casting prismatic rainbows across the polished marble floor as 9-year-old Maribel Torres stepped barefoot into the Arctic blast of air conditioning. Her weathered backpack hung from bony shoulders, its frayed straps cutting into skin that hadn't felt soap in 3 days. The pristine lobby stretched before her like a cathedral of wealth, all gleaming surfaces and hushed conversations punctuated by the soft percussion of expensive heels on stone. Clara Whitmore's manicured fingers paused over her keyboard, pearl-pink nails clicking against the keys as she watched the small intruder with undisguised distaste. At the adjacent desk, Ethan Briggs straightened his silk tie and exchanged a knowing glance with Clara, his mouth curling into the practiced smile he reserved for removing undesirable elements from their establishment. "Ma'am," Clara's voice carried the false sweetness of spoiled honey, "this isn't a place for children to wander around unaccompanied." Maribel's fingers tightened around the crumpled paper in her pocket, the one her mother had pressed into her palm 2 years ago with trembling hands, that smelled of hospital disinfectant and fading roses. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in sharp relief, the gap between her torn sneakers and the Italian leather pumps clicking past. The contrast between her unwashed hair and the perfectly coiffed heads of the clientele. Oliver Reyes looked up from his workstation, pen suspended mid-signature over a loan application, something in the child's posture. The way she held herself with desperate dignity despite the stares reminded him of his grandmother Maggie counting coins at the kitchen table, whispering prayers in Spanish before each trip to deposit her tamale money. His throat tightened as he remembered those small, work-roughened hands teaching him that respect had nothing to do with bank balances. "Excuse me." Maribel's voice barely carried above the ambient hum of commerce, but it cut through Oliver's consciousness like a blade. "My mama said she had an account here. She died, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hung in the perfumed air like smoke signals from a distant fire. Clara's expression shifted from annoyance to theatrical concern, the kind she'd perfected during customer service training. "Sweetheart, you can't just walk into a bank with stories. Where are your parents?" "Your guardian?" Ethan moved closer, his cologne creating a cloud of aggressive masculinity that made Maribel step backward. "Miss Whitmore, perhaps we should call security. We have protocols for situations like this." But Oliver was already rising from his chair, the leather squeaking softly as he stood, the numbers on his computer screen, quarterly reports, interest calculations, suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the tremor in the small voice that had cut through his professional composure. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory. "Mijo, kindness costs nothing, but its absence costs everything." "Wait," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby with unexpected authority. "She said her mother had an account. The least we can do is check, right?" Clara's laugh tinkled like breaking crystal. "Oliver, you're new here. You don't understand how these situations work. These people," she gestured vaguely at Maribel, "they come in with sob stories hoping for handouts." The child's face flushed crimson, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she pulled the wrinkled paper from her pocket with the reverence of someone handling sacred text. The digits written in fading ink seemed to pulse with possibility in the harsh lobby lighting. "Please," Maribel whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 3 sleepless nights on park benches and the echo of her mother's final promise. "Maria Torres. That was my mama's name." Oliver knelt to her eye level, his knees protesting against the cold marble. Up close, he could see the intelligence burning behind her exhaustion, the stubborn tilt of her chin that spoke of survival instincts beyond her years. "What's your name?" "Maribel Torres, and I'm not lying about my mama." The sincerity in her voice hit him like a physical blow. Around them, the bank continued its choreographed dance of commerce, fingers flying over keyboards, phones trilling with opportunities, the soft rustle of money changing hands. But in this small bubble of connection, Oliver felt something shift in his understanding of what his job actually meant. "Come on," he said softly, extending his hand. "Let's see what we can find." As they walked toward his workstation, Clara's whispered comment to Ethan carried clearly in the acoustically perfect space. "He'll learn the hard way. Bleeding hearts don't last long in banking." Oliver's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on Maribel, who clutched his hand with the desperation of someone who had learned that kindness was a rare and precious commodity. Behind them, the revolving door continued its endless rotation, bringing in a steady stream of the wealthy and powerful, none of whom spared a glance for the small girl whose presence was about to turn their perfectly ordered world upside down. Oliver's fingers trembled slightly as he typed the account number from Maribel's precious paper, each keystroke echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over their corner of the lobby. The computer's hard drive whirred softly, processing the request, while Maribel stood pressed against his desk, her small hands leaving ghostly prints on the polished wood surface. 20 miles away, Rick Donnelly cracked open his fourth beer of the morning. The aluminum pop barely audible over the drone of the television. Empty bottles cluttered the coffee table, where bills lay unopened, their red stamps screaming threats he'd grown numb to hearing. When his phone buzzed with an unknown number, he almost ignored it. Creditors had become creative in their pursuit. "Yeah," his voice carried the rasp of cigarettes and disappointed dreams. "Mr. Donnelly, this is about the Torres girl. There's been an interesting development at the bank." The voice was smooth, professional, careful not to identify itself. Rick's attention sharpened like a predator sensing prey. Back in Phoenix, Carmen Torres wiped chalk dust from her hands. Unaware that her carefully constructed life was about to shatter, her third-grade classroom smelled of crayons and fresh hope. 28 small faces looking up at her as she explained fractions using pizza slices drawn on the whiteboard. In her desk drawer, beside emergency contact forms and confiscated toys, lay a faded photograph of her sister Maria, taken before cancer had stolen the light from her eyes. At the bank, Oliver's screen flickered to life with information that made his breath catch in his throat. The numbers seemed impossibly large, a string of digits that transformed Maribel from a homeless child into something else entirely. His hands went cold as he read the balance, $847,000, accumulated through years of small contributions and the patient mathematics of compound interest. Is that my mama's account?" Maribel's voice barely registered above the hum of the air conditioning. Clara appeared beside them as if materialized by greed, her practiced smile slipping as she glimpsed the screen. The color drained from her face, leaving only the artificial flush of her blush standing out like war paint on pale skin. Behind her, Ethan's cologne announced his approach before his shadow fell across the workstation. "There must be some mistake," Clara said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The authority she'd wielded so casually moments before seemed to evaporate in the face of those impossible numbers. Oliver's mind raced through possibilities and protocols, his training warring with his instincts. This wasn't just about banking procedures anymore. This was about a child whose entire future hung in the balance of what happened next. His grandmother's voice whispered in his memory, telling stories of families torn apart by bureaucracy and indifference. "I need to call Mrs. Cooper," he said, reaching for his phone with hands that shook slightly. Diane Cooper, the senior manager, would know how to handle this situation with the delicacy it demanded. Ethan's face had transformed from smugness to calculation, his business mind already working through the implications of their earlier behavior. A client with nearly $1 million deserved very different treatment than a homeless child, but they were impossibly the same person. "Maribel," Oliver said gently, "your mother was very smart. She made sure you'd be taken care of. The girl stared at the screen with confusion rather than joy, the numbers meaningless to someone whose most recent meal had come from a dumpster. Does this mean I can stay? I don't have to sleep outside anymore. The question hung in the air like a prayer, simple and devastating in its innocence. Oliver felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, a realignment of priorities that would change the trajectory of his life. This wasn't about money or policies or career advancement. This was about a child who had been failed by every adult in her life, except a mother who'd worked herself to death to provide for a future she wouldn't live to see. "We're going to figure this out," he promised, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he could see the predatory gleam in Ethan's eyes, the calculating look that Clara was trying to disguise as concern. The same instincts that had made Maribel survive 3 days on the streets were telling her that her troubles were far from over. The money that should have been her salvation might prove to be her greatest danger. Mrs. Cooper's office phone rang with the sharp insistence of an emergency, and somewhere in a rundown house across town, Rick Donnelly was already planning how to claim what he believed should rightfully be his. The wheels of greed and desperation were beginning to turn, and Maribel Torres, clutching Oliver's hand like a lifeline, stood unknowingly at the center of a storm that would test every assumption about justice. Family and the true price of dreams deferred, the afternoon sun slanted through the bank's windows, painting everything in golden light that seemed to promise hope. But shadows were gathering at the edges of that light, and some storms, once they begin, have to be weathered to their bitter end. Diane Cooper's heels clicked against the marble with the decisive rhythm of someone accustomed to being the adult in the room. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a bun that had witnessed 3 decades of banking crises, but nothing quite like the small girl who now sat in her office, dwarfed by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The coffee grew cold between them as Diane studied the documentation spread across her mahogany desk. Maria Torres had been methodical in her planning, each insurance payment recorded with the precision of someone who understood that her daughter's future depended on every penny. The policy documents told a story of midnight shifts and sacrificed meals, of a woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion to buy her child a chance at something better. "Your mother cleaned offices." Diane's voice carried no judgment, only the gentle probing of someone gathering pieces of a puzzle. Maribel nodded, her legs swinging from the oversized chair. "At night, when I was sleeping, sometimes she'd come home with her hands all red from the cleaning stuff. But she'd still help me with homework." Across town, Rick's unknown caller had provided him with enough information to set wheels in motion. The beer was forgotten as he shuffled through a shoebox of papers, looking for anything that might establish legal claim to the Torres windfall, marriage certificates, birth certificates, anything that could be twisted into legitimacy. His hands shook with more than alcohol withdrawal as he contemplated the kind of money that could change everything. The investigation team at Consolidated Insurance worked with the methodical efficiency of people accustomed to fraud attempts. When Oliver's call came through requesting verification of Maria Torres's policy, the clerk pulled up records that painted a picture of desperate hope. Monthly payments of 47.15 never missed despite collection notices from other creditors. Notes in the file mentioned a single mother working multiple jobs, always paying on time despite obvious financial strain. "She must have loved you very much," Diane observed, watching Maribel's reaction carefully. "She said the money was for college. She wanted me to be a teacher. Like she wanted to be before." Maribel's voice trailed off, her small fingers tracing patterns on the desk's surface. Oliver stood by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, as he watched the parking lot below. Clara's car sat in its designated spot, but he'd noticed her making several phone calls since the discovery. His instincts, honed by years of watching his grandmother navigate systems designed to exclude people like them, were screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate. The legal complexities were staggering. Without a clear guardian, the funds would be tied up in probate, while Maribel remained vulnerable to anyone who could establish a claim. Child services had been contacted, but Janet Morrison was juggling 47 cases across 3 counties, each child a crisis competing for her divided attention. Dr. Emily Chen's voice carried compassion and concern when she returned Diane's call. Maria brought Maribel in regularly, even when she couldn't afford the copays. That child was everything to her. If she's saying she was abandoned, I'd believe her completely. The afternoon wore on with the slow agony of bureaucratic processes grinding to life. Forms were filled out in triplicate, phone calls were made to agencies that put them on hold, and Maribel sat through it all with the patient endurance of someone who'd learned that adult problems took adult time to solve. Mrs. Cooper, Maribel's voice was small in the large office, if my mama saved all this money, why did we live in that tiny apartment? Why was she always so tired? The question struck Diane with unexpected force. Her own daughter would have been close to Maribel's age now, if the cancer hadn't taken her 15 years ago. She remembered making similar sacrifices, though never with such desperate circumstances driving them. Because she loved you more than she loved comfort, Diane explained, her professional composure wavering slightly. Sometimes parents give up everything they want, so their children can have everything they need. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Texas plains, the kind of dark mass that promised either relief or devastation, depending on what it brought with it. The atmospheric pressure made everyone's nerves feel stretched thin, conversations more brittle than usual. Oliver's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard you're real fond of that Torres girl. Might want to be careful who you trust. The message sent ice through his veins. Someone was watching, calculating, preparing to strike at the moment of maximum vulnerability. As evening approached, temporary arrangements had to be made. Foster care was backlogged, and the paperwork for accessing Maria's funds would take days to process. Maribel would spend another night in institutional limbo while vultures circled overhead, drawn by the scent of money and opportunity. I want to go home, she whispered to Oliver as they prepared to leave for a temporary placement. I know, he replied, crouching to her eye level once again, but sometimes we have to walk through the storm to get to the sunshine. What none of them realized was that the storm was just beginning, and Rick Donnelly was already driving through the rain toward the bank, practicing the lies that would tear their carefully constructed hope to pieces. The rain hammered against the bank's windows with the fury of a Texas storm that had been brewing all week, each drop exploding against the glass like tiny grenades. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with electrical uncertainty as Marcus Kane's alligator leather briefcase clicked open with the precision of a weapon being loaded. His smile was a predator's smile. Too many teeth, no warmth behind the eyes. Rick Donnelly sat beside him in Diane Cooper's office, his unwashed hair combed back with cheap gel and his best shirt wrinkled from being pulled from the laundry basket. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the slovenly drunk from yesterday, replaced by a grieving stepfather who'd been searching desperately for his missing stepdaughter. She's troubled, Rick explained, his voice catching at precisely the right moments. Since her mother died, she's been running away constantly. I've been beside myself with worry. Maribel stood frozen by the door, Oliver's hand on her shoulder providing the only anchor in a world that was spinning out of control. Her face had gone paper white, the color drained as completely as if someone had opened a valve in her veins. You're lying, she whispered, but her voice was lost in the adult conversation swirling above her head. Kane spread documents across the desk with theatrical flourish, each paper stamped and notarized with impressive authority. Adoption papers dated 2 years prior, signed witness statements from neighbors, even a missing person report filed with local police, all fabricated with professional expertise. The poor child has been traumatized by her mother's illness and death, Kane continued smoothly. She creates elaborate fantasies to cope with her grief. Mr. Donnelly has been receiving counseling recommendations from several qualified psychologists. Diane's fingers drummed against her desk, each tap echoing like gunshots in the tense silence. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but the documentation was convincing, and the law was clear about parental rights without counter-evidence. She was bound by protocols that protected family units, even flawed ones. "He told me he wasn't my real father," Maribel said, finding her voice as desperation gave her strength. "He said he wouldn't take care of someone else's bastard child." Rick's face contorted with perfectly calibrated pain. "See what I mean? These outbursts have been getting worse. Dr. Peterson recommended residential treatment, but I wanted to try keeping the family together first." Oliver felt his hands clench into fists, his grandmother's voice echoing with warnings about men who use children as stepping stones to wealth. What about family members? Surely Maria had relatives who could— "Mr. Reyes," Kane interrupted with silky authority, "while your concern is admirable, legal guardianship isn't determined by bank employees. Mr. Donnelly has full legal authority to make decisions regarding his daughter's welfare and, by extension, her inheritance." The words fell like blows, each syllable designed to strip away hope and agency. Maribel's breathing became shallow and rapid, the panic response of prey, realizing the trap had already closed around them. Clara Whitmore hovered by the door, her earlier smugness replaced by growing unease as she watched the scene unfold. This wasn't how she'd imagined it would go when she'd made those careful phone calls yesterday. The child's terror was too real, too visceral to be manufactured. "There must be some waiting period," Oliver pressed, his professional training warring with his protective instincts. "Some process to verify." "The process," Diane said slowly, her voice heavy with reluctance, "requires that we release custody to the legal guardian while investigations proceed. If there are concerns about the child's welfare, those need to be addressed through proper channels." Rick's smile was triumphant, but carefully modulated, the expression of a man who knew he'd won, but was too cunning to celebrate prematurely. "I understand this is difficult. Maribel has been through so much, but she belongs with family, not in institutions." The storm outside reached a crescendo, thunder rolling across the plains like artillery fire. In the parking lot, rain pooled around the wheels of Rick's rusted pickup truck, the vehicle that would carry Maribel back into captivity, while her mother's carefully planned salvation sat locked behind legal barriers. "Mr. Donnelly will need to provide proper documentation before accessing any funds," Diane explained, her voice professionally neutral despite the acid burning in her stomach. "The inheritance is protected by federal regulations regarding minor beneficiaries." Kane nodded sagely. "Of course, we'll be filing the appropriate paperwork first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, Maribel needs to be in a stable home environment." As they prepared to leave, Maribel grabbed Oliver's jacket with desperate fingers, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please don't let him take me. He's lying about everything." The plea cut through Oliver's chest like broken glass, but Kane was already shepherding them toward the exit. Rick's hand firm on Maribel's shoulder in a grip that looked paternal to observers, but felt like a vice to the child beneath it. Through the rain-streaked windows, Oliver watched the pickup truck disappear into the storm, carrying away the girl who'd changed his understanding of what it meant to protect someone. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, accusing him of failing when it mattered most. But storms, however fierce, eventually pass, and sometimes, in their wake, they leave evidence of crimes that couldn't be hidden while the thunder was rolling. The house smelled of stale beer and broken dreams. Decades of disappointment soaked into walls that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Clinton administration. Maribel sat on the edge of the sagging couch, her small frame lost among cushions that reeked of cigarettes and unwashed laundry. Through the grimy window, she could see Mrs. Rodriguez's garden blooming with defiant beauty. Despite the poverty surrounding it, Rick paced the narrow living room like a caged animal, his euphoria from the bank already curdling into anxiety. The money was so close he could taste it, but Kane's warnings about federal regulations and waiting periods gnawed at him like hunger pains. Every minute that passed was another minute for someone to discover the carefully constructed lies holding his plan together. "Don't even think about running again," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never learned to love anything that couldn't fight back. "I've got lawyers now. Police friends, you disappear, and I'll have every cop in Texas looking for a troubled child who needs psychiatric help." Mrs. Rodriguez's arthritic hands paused over her tomato plants as she heard the raised voice from next door. She'd known Maribel Torres, had watched the young mother struggle with dignity through circumstances that would have crushed weaker spirits. The old woman's weathered face creased with concern as she remembered the promises she'd made to Maria about watching over her little girl. Oliver couldn't sleep. His apartment felt too quiet, too clean, too empty after the chaos of the day. He sat at his kitchen table surrounded by printouts and legal documents, searching for loopholes that might exist in the maze of family law. His laptop screen glowed with search results about fraudulent adoption papers, the kinds of legal precedents that existed but required evidence he didn't have. His phone buzzed with another anonymous text. "Drop it while you still can. Some children can't be saved." The message sent ice water through his veins, but it also crystallized something that had been building since the moment he'd first looked into Maribel's eyes. This wasn't just about banking protocols or professional boundaries anymore. This was about the kind of person he wanted to be when the test came. Dr. Emily Chen's phone rang at 11:30, pulling her from the medical journals that had been consuming her evening. Oliver's voice carried exhaustion and desperate hope in equal measure as he explained the day's events. Her silence stretched long enough for him to wonder if the call had dropped. "That's impossible," she finally said. Maribel Torres was absolutely adamant that Rick Donnelly never formally adopt Maribel. "She came to my office specifically asking about legal protections for children in case of parental death. She was terrified of what would happen if he ever got legal control." The information hit Oliver like a physical blow. "Are you certain?" "I have notes from our conversation. She was researching emancipation procedures for when Maribel turned 14. Ways to legally separate them without causing immediate conflict." Maria was many things, but she was not naive about Rick Donnelly's character. Across town, Rick's phone rang with updates from his mysterious benefactor. The voice was still carefully neutral, but there was an urgency now that made Rick's palms sweat despite the evening chill. "The bank employee is asking questions, making calls. We need to accelerate the timeline." "What does that mean?" Rick asked, though part of him already knew the answer would involve crossing lines he'd never imagined. "It means you file for immediate access tomorrow morning, claim medical emergency expenses for the child, get the money transferred before anyone can dig too deep into the documentation." The plan was elegant in its ruthlessness. Use the system's own protective mechanisms against itself, exploit the very regulations designed to help children in crisis. But it required Rick to perform at a level of deception that made his earlier lies seem like practice rounds. Maribel lay on the couch as night fell, listening to Rick's hushed phone conversations and the distant sound of Mrs. Rodriguez's television playing telenovelas in Spanish. The familiar cadence of her native language was like a lullaby, reminding her of evenings when her mother would translate the dramatic plot twists and teach her about amor verdadero, true love that conquered all obstacles. The irony wasn't lost on her, even at 9 years old. Here she was, trapped in a real-life telenovela where the villain held all the power and the heroes didn't know she needed saving. Through the thin walls, she could hear Rick practicing his grieving stepfather routine, perfecting the catch in his voice when he talked about poor Maribel's mounting therapy bills. But telenovelas, her mother had always insisted, taught important lessons about persistence and faith. The good people always found each other in the end. Even when the darkness seemed absolute, Maribel closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to her mother's memory, asking for the strength to survive whatever came next. Outside, the storm was finally passing, But the real tempest was just beginning. In the morning, Rick would make his move. Oliver would discover the truth about the adoption papers, and the careful house of cards built on greed and deception would start to tremble. Some lies, no matter how well constructed, can't survive the harsh light of day forever. The insurance company's fluorescent lights buzzed with the persistence of trapped insects as Oliver sat across from investigator Sarah Martinez. Her desk cluttered with folders that represented 30 years of human tragedy and hope. The coffee between them had gone cold hours ago, but neither seemed to notice as they pored over Maria Torres's file with the intensity of archaeologists examining sacred texts. She was meticulous, Sarah explained, her finger tracing entries in the payment record, never missed a month. Even when she was hospitalized during the final stages, she'd call from her hospital bed to make sure the premium was paid. The video appeared on her computer screen with the grainy quality of older equipment. But Maria's voice came through with crystal clarity. Even weakened by chemotherapy, her determination was fierce as she looked directly into the camera. If something happens to me, I want my Maribel to be raised by my sister Carmen in Arizona. Rick Donnelly was never supposed to be permanent. He tolerates my daughter because of me, but when I'm gone, her voice broke, tears streaming down hollow cheeks. This money is for her education. Her future, she's so smart, Sarah. She could be anything. Oliver's hands trembled as he watched the woman who'd worked herself to death for love speak about her daughter with such fierce protection. When was this recorded? 3 months before she died. She specifically requested it after Rick started making comments about being stuck with someone else's kid. She was terrified, Mr. Reyes, absolutely terrified of what would happen if he ever got legal control. 2,000 miles away, Carmen Torres erased equations from her classroom whiteboard with mechanical precision, unaware that her carefully ordered world was about to explode. Her students had gone home to families who took their presence for granted, leaving her alone with the ghosts of choices that haunted her quiet evenings. The phone call came as she was locking her classroom door. Oliver's voice tight with urgency as he explained the impossible situation unfolding in Texas. Carmen sank into a student desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight as the enormity of her failure crashed over her. I tried to find them after Maria got sick, she whispered, her voice breaking. I called every hospital, every clinic, but she was using Rick's last name by then, and I stopped looking when I should have kept searching. Carmen, she needs you now. Maribel needs you now. I'm driving tonight. Don't let them do anything irreversible until I get there. At Lone Star Bank, Diane Cooper worked late into the evening, her office lit by the pale glow of computer screens, displaying federal regulations and legal precedents. The adoption papers Rick had presented were sophisticated forgeries, but subtle inconsistencies were beginning to emerge under careful scrutiny. Dates that didn't align, witness signatures that appeared too similar, notary seals that had been reported stolen from a Dallas law office 6 months ago. Her phone buzzed with an urgent call from the State Fraud Division. Mrs. Cooper, we've been tracking Marcus Kane for 2 years. If he's involved in this case, you need to understand that everything he touches turns to poison. The revelation sent her reaching for her emergency contact list, fingers flying over numbers for Child Protective Services. The FBI Financial Crimes Division, and Oliver's personal cell phone. The web of deception was more elaborate than anyone had imagined, but it was also more fragile than its creators realized. Rick spent the evening rehearsing his performance for tomorrow's bank visit, practicing the concerned stepfather routine in the bathroom mirror while Maribel pretended to sleep on the couch. His reflection looked convincing enough, the stubble trimmed to suggest worry rather than neglect. Eyes reddened with artificial tears from cheap eye drops, but his hands shook as he dialed Kane's number, and his voice cracked when the lawyer answered. "We have a problem," Rick began, then stopped. Through the thin walls of his house, he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez talking on her phone in rapid Spanish, her voice carrying the urgency of someone reporting a crime. "I think the old woman next door is getting suspicious." Kane's response was cold and immediate. "Then we move tomorrow, first thing in the morning. Before anyone else can interfere, the money gets transferred, and the child becomes your problem to manage." The plan was falling apart faster than it had been constructed. But greed is a powerful motivator, and both men had crossed lines that made retreat impossible. They would push forward with desperate aggression, hoping to grab the prize before the house of cards collapsed completely around them. Mrs. Rodriguez finished her phone call to Janet Morrison from Child Services, her voice shaking with righteous anger as she reported the sounds of distress she'd been hearing from next door. Her English was broken, but her concern was universal in its clarity. "That man, he no good for the Nina. She cry at night and he drink, and I hear him practice lies on telephone." Janet Morrison added the report to Maribel's file with the weary efficiency of someone who'd learned that the system moved too slowly for children in crisis. But this case had red flags that demanded immediate attention. Potential fraud, missing relatives, and a child whose safety hung in the balance of adult greed. As midnight approached, phone calls were being made across 3 time zones. Carmen Torres drove through the Arizona desert with tears streaming down her face, pushing her Honda Civic beyond safe speeds as she raced toward a niece she'd failed to protect. Oliver sat in his apartment surrounded by evidence of systematic deception, preparing for a confrontation that would define his character forever, and in a house that smelled of broken dreams. Maribel Torres whispered prayers to her mother's memory, asking for the strength to survive one more day. The morning would bring revelations that would shatter carefully constructed lies and reveal the true nature of everyone involved. Some people rise to meet their testing moments with courage and integrity. Others discover that they're capable of cruelties they never imagined. Dawn broke over Texas with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows violent storms. The air washed clean but electric with possibility. Carmen Torres's Honda Civic pulled into the Lone Star Bank parking lot just as Marcus Kane's black Mercedes glided to a stop near the entrance. Timing that would prove either providential or catastrophic, depending on perspective. Inside the bank, Oliver stood beside Diane Cooper's desk, with evidence spread between them like weapons prepared for battle. The forged adoption papers lay exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Their inconsistencies now glaringly obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Last warning, walk away or face consequences." Rick's hands trembled as he straightened his tie in the men's room mirror. The reflection staring back at him, showing a man who'd crossed moral lines he couldn't uncross. The eye drops had worked too well. His eyes were bloodshot and streaming, making him look genuinely distraught rather than calculating. In 30 minutes, he would either be rich or imprisoned, with very little middle ground between those outcomes. "Showtime," Kane murmured as they approached the bank entrance. His briefcase loaded with documents that wouldn't survive expert scrutiny, but might hold long enough to complete the transaction. Carmen Torres burst through the revolving door with the force of maternal fury, delayed too long, her teacher's instincts scanning the lobby until they locked onto a familiar figure near the customer service counter. Maribel stood beside Rick with the resigned posture of prey that had stopped running, her small hand clutched in his grip like a trapped bird. Maribel. The name rang across the marble lobby with the power of salvation itself. Maribel's head whipped around, her eyes widening with disbelief as she saw the face from faded photographs coming toward her like an answer to desperate prayers. "Tia Carmen," the Spanish word came out like a sob. And suddenly, the careful choreography of Rick's deception began to unravel with the speed of an avalanche. "Get away from my niece," Carmen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of unruly children. "Get your hands off her right now." Rick's face went pale beneath his artificial tan as he realized his careful research hadn't been thorough enough. The existence of Carmen Torres represented a catastrophic failure in planning, a wild card that could destroy everything he'd worked toward. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Kane interjected smoothly, stepping between Carmen and Rick with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling situations. Mr. Donnelly is the child's legal guardian. If you have concerns, they need to be addressed through proper channels. Proper channels. Carmen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. I have Maria's death certificate, Maribel's birth certificate, and a will that specifically names me as guardian. What do you have besides forged papers and a pocket full of lies? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Around them, bank customers began to notice the confrontation, conversations dying as attention focused on the drama unfolding near the customer service counter. Oliver moved closer, his evidence folder clutched like a shield. Mrs. Cooper, I think we need to see what Mrs. Torres has brought with her. Diane emerged from her office with the measured steps of someone who'd dealt with family disputes before, but her expression shifted when she saw Carmen's documentation. Real birth certificates had a different weight than forgeries, an authenticity that was immediately apparent to trained eyes. Mr. Kane, Diane said slowly, her voice carrying new authority. I'm going to need to verify these competing claims before any financial transactions can proceed. That's completely unnecessary, Kane replied. But sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead despite the Arctic air conditioning. We have court-approved documentation that establishes documents that were notarized with stolen seals, Oliver interrupted, pulling out printouts from the fraud division, witness signatures that belong to people who've never heard of Rick Donnelly. Should I continue? The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Rick's face cycled through expressions like a man watching his life collapse in slow motion: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally, the kind of rage that comes from dreams dying violently. You people don't understand, he snarled, his careful facade cracking like ice under pressure. I put up with that kid for 2 years. 2 years of tantrums and bills and constant reminders that her mother was dead. I earned this money through suffering. The admission hit the lobby like a physical blow. Several customers moved protectively closer to Maribel, creating an unconscious barrier between her and the man who'd just revealed his true nature to a room full of witnesses. Carmen knelt to Maribel's eye level, her hands gentle on small shoulders that had carried too much weight for too long. Mi amor, I'm so sorry I wasn't there before, but I'm here now, and I'm never letting anyone hurt you again. Tia Carmen, Maribel whispered, tears flowing freely for the first time since her mother's death. I knew you'd come, Mama said. Family always finds family. Security guards appeared as if materialized by the tension, their presence transforming the emotional confrontation into something more official and final. Kane was already calculating exit strategies, his loyalty to Rick extending only as far as profitable representation. Mr. Donnelly, Diane said with the calm authority of someone delivering judgment, I'm placing a hold on all accounts associated with this case pending federal investigation. You'll need to accompany these officers for questioning about fraudulent documentation. As Rick was led away in handcuffs, his curses echoing through the pristine lobby, Carmen held Maribel close while Oliver stood nearby with tears in his eyes. Sometimes justice arrives with the sudden violence of a summer storm, washing away corruption and leaving clean ground for new growth. But the real healing would take time, patience, and the kind of love that builds bridges across years of separation and sorrow. 6 months later, the Arizona sun painted Carmen's small house in shades of gold and possibility. Streaming through windows that had been cleaned so many times, they sparkled like crystal. The rooms smelled of flour tortillas and fresh paint, transformation evident in every corner where love had replaced loneliness with the comfortable chaos of family life. Maribel sat at the kitchen table, homework spread before her like conquered territory, her pencil moving with the confidence of someone discovering her own intelligence for the first time in years. The numbers on her math worksheet made sense now, logical progressions that reminded her of her mother's careful planning rather than obstacles designed to defeat her. Tia, look, she called out, holding up a paper marked with a gold star and the teacher's comment, "Exceptional work, Maribel. You have real mathematical intuition." Carmen smiled from where she stood at the stove, stirring beans that had been simmering since dawn. The domestic ritual felt as natural as breathing now, though the first months had been an adjustment for both of them. Learning to be a family required patience, forgiveness, and the kind of daily small kindnesses that build trust, one moment at a time. Oliver's voice carried warm affection when he called that evening, his regular check-in that had become as essential as prayer for all of them. He was finishing his final semester in social work, his bank salary carefully saved to fund a career change that felt like destiny rather than choice. "How's school?" he asked, and Maribel's excited chatter filled the phone with stories of science projects and new friends who knew nothing about her past, except that she was smart and kind and worth knowing. "Oliver wants to know if you're still planning to visit for Christmas," Carmen translated. Though Maribel had understood perfectly, her English had improved dramatically, but she treasured the moments when her aunt spoke Spanish. Connecting her to cultural roots that Rick had tried to sever, the Maribel Torres Foundation occupied a small office in downtown Phoenix, but its impact was already spreading across 3 states. Carmen had used a portion of Maribel's inheritance to create something that would honor her sister's memory while helping children who faced similar circumstances, orphans caught in legal limbo, kids aging out of foster care, students whose potential was buried under poverty and neglect. Dr. Emily Chen served on the board of directors, her medical expertise helping identify children whose health needs masked deeper issues of abuse or abandonment. Janet Morrison contributed her hard-won knowledge of how systems failed vulnerable kids, working to create safety nets that actually caught people when they fell. The first scholarship recipient was Miguel Santos, a 15-year-old whose mother had died in a factory accident, leaving him to raise 3 younger siblings while his father worked double shifts. Maribel had insisted on meeting him personally, recognizing something familiar in his determined optimism despite overwhelming odds. "Education is the ladder," she told him solemnly, repeating words her mother had whispered during bedtime stories. "You climb it one rung at a time, and you help pull other people up behind you." Oliver visited monthly, his presence bringing stability and continuity to Maribel's new life. He was different now, more focused, less concerned with advancement and more interested in advancement for others. His professors noted his unusual passion for child advocacy law, the way he approached case studies as if each hypothetical situation represented real children who needed real help. The nightmares had mostly stopped, though sometimes Maribel woke reaching for her mother's hand or calling out warnings about Rick's return. Carmen would sit with her during those dark hours, singing lullabies in Spanish, while Arizona stars wheeled overhead like distant promises of better mornings. "Do you think Mama knows?" Maribel asked one evening, as they walked through the neighborhood where children played in front yards without fear, where neighbors knew each other's names and watched out for each other's kids. "Knows what, mi amor?" "That we're happy that her plan worked." Carmen stopped walking, kneeling to meet eyes that had seen too much but still held hope. "Your mama knows everything that matters. She sees you studying hard, being kind to your friends, growing into the person she dreamed you'd become. That's what love does. It keeps working even when the person who gave it can't be there anymore." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, past houses where families gathered for dinner, where porch lights promised safety and belonging. The money in Maribel's accounts would ensure her future, but it was the love surrounding her now that made that future worth having. In Texas, the legal proceedings against Rick and Kane had concluded with prison sentences that satisfied justice, if not vengeance. Clara Whitmore worked retail now, her banking career ended by her role in the conspiracy. Sometimes in quiet moments, she wondered about the little girl whose dignity she dismissed so carelessly. But Maribel Torres was no longer the frightened child who'd walked barefoot into that bank seeking salvation. She was becoming something more powerful, a young woman who understood that being saved meant accepting the responsibility to save others when her turn came. The transformation was subtle but profound, visible in the way she helped struggling classmates with math, donated her allowance to animal shelters, and talked about becoming a teacher like her aunt. The cycle of love and sacrifice that had begun with her mother's midnight cleaning jobs was continuing. Growing stronger with each generation, the Texas heat shimmered off the Lone Star Bank's parking lot like memories rising from overheated asphalt. But inside the climate-controlled lobby, the temperature remained as perfectly regulated as corporate policy demanded. Maribel Torres walked through the revolving door with the confident stride of someone returning to claim victory from the scene of former defeat. At 10 years old, she bore little resemblance to the frightened child who'd sought refuge here 18 months ago. Her hair was neatly braided with ribbons that Carmen had chosen to match her dress, and her shoes, real shoes that fit properly and weren't worn through at the toes, clicked against the marble with small authority. Oliver waited by the customer service counter, his social work degree finally complete, and his new position with Arizona Child Services beginning next month. The transformation in him was equally dramatic. Gone was the uncertain bank employee, replaced by someone who understood his purpose with crystalline clarity. "Ready for this?" he asked, offering his arm with mock formality. "I've been ready since the day I left," Maribel replied, her voice carrying an accent that blended Texas pragmatism with Arizona warmth. This is where everything started to change. The ceremony was modest by banking standards, but profound in its implications. Diane Cooper had organized the event to honor employees who demonstrated exceptional character under pressure. But everyone understood it was really about acknowledging how close they'd come to failing a child who'd trusted them with her last hope. Staff members who'd witnessed the original confrontation gathered in the small conference room adjacent to the lobby, their faces reflecting various degrees of shame, pride, and genuine curiosity about how the story had ended. The new employees listened with wide eyes as Diane recounted events that had become legendary within the company. "Sometimes our most important work has nothing to do with interest rates or quarterly reports," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. "Sometimes it's about remembering that every person who walks through our doors has a story that matters." Carmen stood beside her niece with quiet pride, her teacher's eye noting how naturally Maribel commanded adult attention without seeming to try. The scholarship foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, funded partly by Maribel's inheritance, but sustained by donations from people who understood that helping children was an investment in everyone's future. When Maribel was invited to speak, she approached the small podium with the poise of someone who'd learned that words had power and should be used carefully. The room fell silent as she looked out at faces that had once dismissed her as unworthy of basic courtesy. "My mama used to clean offices at night," she began, her voice clear and strong. "She'd come home with her hands all red from chemicals, but she'd still help me with homework because she said education was the only thing nobody could take away from you." The silence deepened as her words struck home. Several staff members shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own assumptions about children from certain backgrounds. "When I came here the first time, I was scared and dirty and probably didn't smell very good. Some people looked at me like I was worth nothing, but Oliver looked at me like I was worth everything. That's the difference between just doing a job and actually helping people." Oliver wiped his eyes discreetly, remembering his grandmother's lessons about seeing dignity in every person, regardless of circumstances. The scared little girl who'd grabbed his hand for protection had become someone who could articulate wisdom that adults struggled to understand. "The money my mama saved was important," Maribel continued, "but what Oliver gave me was more valuable. He gave me hope when I thought there wasn't any left. He reminded me that some people fight for what's right, even when it's hard." "Doctor," Emily Chen applauded from the back of the room, her medical training allowing her to recognize resilience when she saw it. This child had survived trauma that destroyed some adults, emerging stronger and more compassionate rather than bitter and closed. The Maribel Torres Foundation had established its first permanent office in a renovated building downtown, with plans to expand services across the Southwest. Carmen had taken a sabbatical from teaching to manage operations, discovering administrative skills she hadn't known she possessed. "We've helped 12 families so far," Maribel announced with obvious pride. "Kids who needed lawyers or medical care or just someone to believe their stories when the adults around them wouldn't listen." The applause was genuine and sustained, filled with recognition that this ceremony represented more than corporate public relations. It was acknowledgement that their industry's real success should be measured not in profits, but in human lives improved by ethical choices made under pressure. As the formal program concluded, Maribel approached the reception desk where Clara had once worked. The current employee, a young woman named Jennifer, listened with fascination as Maribel pointed out details of her original visit, where she'd stood while being judged, what the adults had said when they thought she couldn't understand the implications. It wasn't about the money, even though everyone thought it was, Maribel explained. It was about being seen as a real person instead of a problem that needed to go away. Oliver joined them, his hand naturally falling to Maribel's shoulder in the protective gesture that had become automatic between them. Their relationship had evolved into something unique, not quite father and daughter, but more than mentor and student. Family came in many forms, and some bonds were chosen rather than inherited. "Are you nervous about the new school?" he asked as they prepared to leave. "A little," Maribel admitted. "But nervous is different from scared. Scared is when you don't have any choices. Nervous is when you have lots of choices and want to make good ones." The distinction was profound, representing growth that couldn't be measured in bank balances or grade point averages. She'd learned the difference between surviving and thriving, between existing and actually living with purpose and hope. As they walked toward the exit, Maribel paused at the spot where she'd first encountered Oliver's kindness. The marble floor looked exactly the same, polished to mirror brightness and reflecting fluorescent lights with impersonal efficiency, but everything else had changed completely. The Phoenix Cemetery stretched across rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees, their thorny branches casting intricate shadows over graves that told stories of dreams deferred and love remembered. Maribel knelt beside her mother's headstone, the polished granite warm from the Arizona sun that had been climbing toward noon since dawn, broke clear and promising. "Mama, I have so much to tell you," she whispered, her fingers tracing letters carved with reverent precision. "Maria Elena Torres, beloved mother, she gave everything so her daughter could have everything." The words had been Maribel's choice, selected after months of consideration about how to summarize a life that had been defined by sacrifice and unwavering love. Carmen sat on a nearby bench, giving her niece privacy for conversations that bridged the gap between memory and hope. At 11 years old, Maribel possessed an eloquence that surprised adults who expected childhood trauma to diminish rather than deepen character. Her teachers spoke of unusual empathy, the way she gravitated toward classmates who seemed lost or struggling, offering friendship with the intuitive understanding of someone who knew what isolation felt like. "I'm in 6th grade now, and my teacher, Mrs. Patterson, says I might skip 7th grade if I keep working hard." "Can you believe that? Your daughter might be ahead in school instead of behind." She laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes in gentle breeze. The Maribel Torres Foundation occupied a 3-story building now, its success requiring expansion that would have seemed impossible when it began as Carmen's kitchen table operation. The walls were covered with letters from families who'd been helped, photographs of children whose lives had been transformed by intervention at crucial moments. Oliver visited monthly, his own career flourishing as he built a reputation for fierce advocacy on behalf of vulnerable children. He'd testified before state legislatures about gaps in protective systems, written policy papers that influenced federal regulations, and trained social workers across the region to recognize signs of exploitation that might otherwise go unnoticed. He's like the big brother I always wanted. Maribel continued her one-sided conversation with Maria's memory. He taught me that protecting people is something you choose to do every day, not just when it's convenient or easy. A butterfly landed on the headstone, its wings iridescent in the sunlight as it rested between the engraved roses that framed Maria's name. Maribel watched it with the patient attention she'd learned from observing her aunt-grade papers, finding beauty in small moments that might otherwise pass unnoticed. The scholarship program had evolved beyond its original scope, creating mentorship networks that connected at-risk youth with adults who understood their struggles. Miguel Santos, the foundation's first recipient, was now studying engineering at Arizona State University while tutoring younger students who reminded him of his former self. "We helped a little girl last week whose situation was almost exactly like mine," Maribel said, her voice carrying wonder at the circular nature of compassion. "Her name is Sophia, and she was so scared she could barely talk. But Carmen and I sat with her, and Oliver made sure the bad people couldn't hurt her anymore. The legal precedents established by Rick's prosecution had strengthened protections for children in similar circumstances, making it harder for predators to exploit bureaucratic delays and systemic gaps. Several states had revised their guardian verification procedures, requiring more thorough background checks and waiting periods designed to catch fraudulent claims before they could cause harm. Carmen approached quietly, her footsteps careful on the gravel path that wound between carefully tended graves. At 47, she'd discovered purposes she'd never imagined, finding fulfillment in work that felt more like mission than career. "Ready to go, mi amor." Maribel stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees while keeping her eyes fixed on the headstone that had become a place of pilgrimage rather than simple memorial. "Almost. I want to tell her about the letter." The letter had arrived that morning from Consolidated Insurance. Formal notification that Maria's policy had been used as a model for new products designed to protect children whose parents worked in high-risk occupations. Her careful planning and desperate love had inspired changes that would help families she'd never meet, extending her legacy far beyond what she could have imagined. "Your mama's love is still working," Carmen observed, understanding the significance better than most adults would. "Every time we help someone, every time Oliver fights for a child who can't fight for themselves, every time you choose kindness over anger, that's her love continuing to make the world better." The observation resonated with profound truth. Love, once given authentically, became a force that operated independent of its original source, growing stronger as it was shared rather than diminished by distribution. They walked toward the car in comfortable silence, past graves that marked endings but also celebrated lives that had mattered to someone. The cemetery was peaceful without being sad, a place where memory transformed grief into gratitude for having been loved completely, even if briefly. "Do you think she knows about college?" Maribel asked as they reached the parking lot. "What about college?" "That I want to study social work like Oliver, that I want to help kids who feel invisible, like I felt before he saw me." Carmen smiled, recognizing the moment when childhood dreams crystallized into adult purpose. "Your mama knows everything that matters, and she's probably not surprised at all." The drive home took them past the elementary school where Carmen taught, the foundation office where miracles happened daily, and the park where Maribel had learned to play without constantly looking over her shoulder for danger. Each landmark represented security built on love rather than fear. That evening, Oliver called with news that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. He'd been offered a position with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a chance to influence policy at the federal level and protect vulnerable children across the entire country. "Are you going to take it?" Maribel asked, though she already knew the answer from the excitement in his voice. "How can I not? But you know this doesn't change anything between us, right? You're stuck with me forever." Whether you want to be or not, the conversation continued for an hour, planning visits and discussing how distance wouldn't diminish the bonds that had been forged in crisis and strengthened through shared purpose. Some relationships transcend geography, sustained by mutual respect and genuine affection. As bedtime approached, Maribel sat at her desk working on a letter to Sophia, the frightened little girl who reminded her so much of her former self. The words came easily, carrying wisdom earned through experience rather than theory. "Dear Sophia," she wrote, "I know you're scared right now, but I want you to know that scared isn't permanent. Neither is alone. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things we never could have imagined." Outside her window, Arizona stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, each point of light representing hope persisting through darkness. The desert air carried the scent of blooming cactus flowers, beauty emerging from environments that seemed too harsh to sustain anything delicate. Carmen paused in the doorway, watching her niece work with the focused intensity that characterized everything she undertook. The transformation from broken child to confident young woman had required patience, professional help, and the daily choice to believe that healing was possible. "Lights out in 15 minutes, she said softly. "Almost finished," Maribel replied, signing her letter with careful script that would have made her mother proud. "I'm telling Sophia about how sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you expect. How kindness can come from strangers who choose to see you as worth saving." The letter would be mailed tomorrow, carrying hope across the miles to a child who needed to know that survival was possible, that love could be found in unexpected places, and that the worst chapters of life didn't have to determine how the story ended. Sometimes the most precious treasures really are found where we least expect them, especially in the hearts of those who choose to see humanity where others see only differences. Love, once planted with sacrifice and nurtured with sacrifice, grows beyond imagination, blessing lives that were never part of the original plan but become essential to its ultimate fulfillment. The cycle continues. One saved child helping to save another, kindness multiplying across generations like interest compounding in accounts opened with the currency of human compassion. What an incredible journey this has been. From a frightened child seeking hope in an unwelcoming place to a confident young woman dedicated to ensuring no other child faces such darkness alone. Sometimes the most ordinary moments contain extraordinary possibilities for changing lives forever.